The snow started falling before dawn, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama at first, just a quiet, steady accumulation that looks harmless until it isn't. By the time the sky turned gray and the neighborhood lights flickered off, one by one, the streets were already buried under a thick, uneven blanket. This wasn't the decorative snowfall meant for photos. This was the kind that shut things down, trapped cars in place, and turned every small decision into a potential problem. And in this neighborhood, problems had a way of attracting the attention of the HOA. The truck sat in the driveway like it always had, large, practical, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't new or flashy, but it was built for moments exactly like this. Heavy tires, solid clearance, a quiet sense of reliability that had proven itself over years of bad weather and worse roads. On most days it blended into the routine of suburban life without much thought. On this day, with snow piling higher by the hour, it became a symbol, and symbols had a way of making certain people uncomfortable. The neighborhood itself looked frozen in time. Identical houses lined the street, their neutral colors now buried beneath white drifts. Mailboxes leaned under the weight of snow, and driveways disappeared entirely, erasing the neat boundaries the HOA loved to enforce. For once, nature had ignored the rulebook, but the HOA had never been known to accept being ignored. By mid-morning, the snow was still falling, thick and relentless. Plows hadn't arrived yet, and the main road beyond the entrance was already clogged with stalled vehicles, the kind of storm that tested patience and common sense. Most residents stayed inside, watching through windows, hoping someone else would deal with the mess first. But the HOA didn't wait for conditions to improve. They never did. The first sign came in the form of an email alert, and sent out with the urgency of a crisis, but the tone of authority. It referenced community standards, emergency access, and vehicle placement. It didn't mention the weather as an exception. It never did. The truck, according to the HOA, was suddenly a concern. Its presence in the driveway, its size, its visibility, all framed as violations waiting to happen. The storm outside didn't soften their stance. If anything, it sharpened it. The irony was impossible to miss. While snow choked the streets and blocked sidewalks, the HOA's focus narrowed onto a single vehicle sitting quietly on private property. The truck wasn't obstructing traffic. It wasn't blocking access. It was simply there, doing what it had always done. But to the HOA, consistency didn't matter. Control did. As the hours passed, the messages escalated. Warnings replaced reminders. References to fines appeared, then threats of towing once conditions allowed. The storm became a footnote, treated as an inconvenience rather than a reality. The HOA framed their actions as proactive, as if enforcing rules during a blizzard somehow demonstrated responsibility. In truth, it revealed something else entirely. Outside, the snow continued its work, indifferent to authority. Wind carved drifts across the street, erasing tire tracks almost as soon as they appeared. A few neighbors attempted to shovel, only to give up when the effort proved pointless. Others watched from behind curtains, aware that the HOA's attention, once focused, rarely stayed isolated. What started with one truck could easily spread. The truck itself became more than transportation. It became a point of quiet defiance, not through action, but through presence. It didn't move, it didn't change. It simply existed, sturdy and unmoved by both weather and pressure, and that seemed to bother the HOA more than anything else. Another notice arrived, more aggressive this time. It cited emergency access again, despite the fact that emergency vehicles wouldn't be able to reach the street regardless. The logic didn't matter. The appearance of enforcement did. The HOA needed to show control, especially when circumstances stripped them of it elsewhere. The snowstorm was chaos. The truck was something they could point to. As daylight faded, the neighborhood grew quieter. The storm showed no signs of slowing, and the silence felt heavy. The truck's outline softened under layers of snow, but its shape remained unmistakable. It was still there, still solid, still unbothered. Inside, the sense of inevitability grew. The HOA wouldn't let this go. They never backed down once they'd drawn a line, even if that line was buried under a foot of snow. What the HOA didn't account for was how storms change dynamics. Rules written for sunny days don't hold the same weight when conditions turn extreme. People notice priorities more clearly. They remember who helped and who harassed. And as the storm tightened its grip on the neighborhood, those observations quietly stacked up, and the final message of the day arrived just as night settled in. It was framed as a last warning, a promise of consequences once the storm passed. It carried the confidence of an organization certain of its authority, unaware of how fragile that authority actually was. The truck remained where it was, and silent, while the HOA doubled down on a threat that would soon come back to haunt them as darkness swallowed the street and the storm raged on. One thing became clear. This wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about control, perception, and what happens when rigid enforcement collides with reality. And when the snow finally stopped, The HOA was going to learn just how badly they had misjudged both. The storm finally broke sometime before dawn, not with a dramatic ending, but with a slow retreat. The wind softened first, then the snowfall thinned into scattered flakes before stopping altogether. What it left behind was a transformed neighborhood, quiet and immobilized, buried under layers of snow that reflected the early morning light. Streets were unrecognizable, sidewalks vanished, and driveways became shallow valleys carved by uneven drifts. It was the kind of aftermath that demanded cooperation and patience, two things the HOA had already proven they lacked. As residents stepped outside to assess the damage, the scale of the situation became clear. Cars were trapped, some buried up to their doors, mail trucks hadn't arrived, trash pickup was suspended indefinitely, emergency access was theoretical at best, and in the middle of it all, the truck still sat in the driveway, snow-covered but ready, exactly as it had been the night before. While most people focused on survival tasks like shoveling and checking on neighbors, the HOA moved quickly, faster than the plows, faster than any real assistance. Notices went out again, this time referencing post-storm compliance. The language was sharper, almost eager. The storm was over, they claimed, and enforcement could resume. The truck was, once again, identified as a violation, accused of being improperly positioned, too visible, too large. The threat of towing was no longer hypothetical. What the HOA failed to realize was that the storm had changed how people were paying attention. Neighbors who had once ignored emails now read them carefully. Residents who had quietly tolerated enforcement began to compare notes. The timing felt wrong. While roads were impassable and people were struggling just to get out of their homes, the HOA's priority remained a single truck that posed no real threat to anyone. The first plow didn't arrive until late morning, and even then, it barely cleared a narrow path through the main entrance. Side streets were left untouched. The truck became useful almost immediately, helping clear snow, pulling stuck vehicles free, creating paths where none existed. It did what the HOA could not or would not, and people noticed that as the day went on. Frustration grew not with the weather, but with the HOA. Their messages continued, each one more detached from reality than the last. They spoke of order while the neighborhood remained buried. They threatened consequences while residents relied on each other to function. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Then came the turning point. The HOA attempted to escalate enforcement despite the conditions. The effort was clumsy and poorly timed. With roads still unstable and services delayed, their actions drew attention from outside the neighborhood. Complaints were filed. Screenshots circulated. The story spread beyond private inboxes and into public view. What had once been a quiet power struggle became visible to people who didn't answer to the HOA instant. Karma rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often, it comes as a sequence of small failures that expose larger weaknesses. The HOA began receiving pushback they weren't prepared for. Residents cited emergency necessity. Others referenced local ordinances that temporarily overrode HOA rules during severe weather. The authority the HOA leaned on so heavily suddenly felt fragile. Meanwhile, the truck remained exactly where it was supposed to be, serving a purpose no rulebook had accounted for. Its presence was no longer just tolerated, it was appreciated. The narrative had shifted. The HOA wasn't protecting the community. It was hindering it. By the second day after the storm, the tone changed. Messages slowed, threats softened, references to fines disappeared entirely. The HOA, faced with scrutiny and internal resistance, quietly backed away from the issue. No towing occurred. No penalties were enforced. The truck was never mentioned again. The aftermath lingered longer than the snow itself. Trust in the HOA eroded. Meetings became tense. Questions were asked that had been avoided for years. People remembered who had enforced rules during a crisis and who had actually helped. The storm had stripped away more than just SNET had exposed priorities. In the end, the truck didn't need to move. The HOA did. What started as a threat during a snowstorm ended as a lesson in overreach. Authority without judgment collapses under pressure, and rigid rules don't survive real-world tests. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but something fundamental had shifted. The HOA's grip was weaker, its confidence shaken every time it snowed after that. The truck sat in the driveway without issue, a quiet reminder of the storm that taught the HOA exactly where their power ended.